Livy on Hannibal, Book 27. 1. This was how matters stood in Spain. In Italy, meanwhile, the consul Marcellus gained Salapia, when the town was betrayed to him, and Memori and Meles he took by force from the Samnites. Some 3,000 of Hannibal's men, who had been left to garrison these towns, were overpowered within them, and the plunder taken, which was considerable, was left to the Roman soldiers. 240,000 measures of wheat were also found, and 110,000 measures of barley. However, the joy over the success in no way compensated for the disaster sustained within a few days of it, not far from the city of Herdonia. The proconsul Gnaeus Fulvius was encamped in the area, hoping to recover Herdonia, which had defected from the Romans after the defeat at Cannae. He was not, however, in a very safe or well-secured position. Carelessness was ingrained in the general's nature, and his hopes were increasing it, for Fulvius had learned that the inhabitants' loyalty to the Carthaginian had been wavering ever since the news had arrived that, after losing Salapia, Hannibal had left the area for Bruttium. All this had been duly reported to Hannibal by messengers sent covertly from Hardona, making him anxious to hold on to an allied city, and also giving him hope of making a surprise attack on the enemy. Taking a light-armed force, he hurried towards Hardonia by forced marches, so swiftly that he almost outrun word of his coming, and to strike greater terror in his enemy, he approached the town with a line deployed for battle. The Roman, who was Hannibal's equal in daring, but not his equal in strategy and military strength, swiftly led out his troops and engaged, and the 5th Legion and the allied contingent on the left vigorously entered the fray. Hannibal, however, had given a signal to his cavalry to ride around the battle when the lines of infantry had everyone's eyes and attention focused on the struggle in progress. Some were to swoop down on the enemy's camp, others on their rear as they made their attack. 2 years earlier, Hannibal had defeated the praetor Gnaeus Fulvius in the same area, and now he uttered caustic remarks about this Gnaeus Fulvius having the same name, and declared that the battle would also have the same outcome. This proved no idle fancy on Hannibal's part. Many of the Romans had fallen in the hand-to-hand fighting during the clash of the 2 infantry lines, but the ranks were still holding their ground in formation. Then the uproar raised by the cavalry was heard to their rear, and so were the shouts of the enemy in their camp. The noise first of all made the 6th Legion fall back. It had been stationed in the second line, and so was the first to be thrown into disarray by the Numidians, and then the 5th, and those at the very front. Some scattered in flight, others were killed in the thick of the action, and there Gnaeus Fulvius himself went down, along with 11 military tribunes. How many thousands of Romans and allies were killed in that battle one could not categorically state, not when I find 13,000 in one author and more than 7,000 in another. The victor took possession of the camp and its spoils, because he had information that Hardonia had been on the point of defecting to the Romans, and would not have remained loyal had he withdrawn from there. Hannibal removed the entire population to Metapontum and Thurii, and burned the town. Its leading citizens, who it was discovered had held clandestine discussions with Fulvius, he put to the sword. The Romans who had escaped the disastrous encounter sought refuge in Samnium with the consul Marcellus, to whom they came, poorly armed, by various routes. 2. Marcellus was not in the least perturbed by this disastrous defeat. He wrote a letter to the Senate in Rome to report the loss of the general and the army at Herdonia, but added that he himself was still the same man who, after the battle of Cannae, had crushed Hannibal when he was full of himself over his victory. He was now going to face him, he said, and would see to it that the Carthaginians' exhilaration and gloating were short-lived. In Rome, at all events, there was deep melancholy over what had happened, as well as fear for the future. The consul, however, marched from Samnium unto Lucania, and pitched his camp on level ground at Numistro, in full view of Hannibal, while the Carthaginian established himself on a hill. Marcellus then gave a further indication of his confidence by being the first to deploy his troops in battle formation, and when he saw the standards issuing forth from the gates, Hannibal did not refuse battle. But they marshaled their battle lines in such a way that the Carthaginians had his right wing extended up the hill, while the Romans had their left close to the town. The troops first sent in by the Romans were the First Legion and the allied right flank, and by Hannibal, his Spanish troops and Balearic slingers, his elephants also being driven into battle once the engagement got under way. For a long while the battle favored neither side. They drew out the action from the third hour until nightfall, and when the front lines were exhausted from fighting, the First Legion was relieved by the Third, and the allies on the right of those on the left, by those on the left. On the side of the enemy, too, fresh troops took over the battle from those who were spent. Thanks to this injection of fresh spirit and strength, a renewed and savage struggle suddenly flared up from one that had flagged. But night parted the combatants with victory unclear. The following day the Romans stood in the battle line from sunrise until well into the day, and when none of the enemy came forward to face them, they took their time gathering up their spoils, and heaped their dead up in one spot and burned them. That coming night Hannibal quietly struck camp and went off into Apulia. When daylight revealed that his enemy had fled, Marcellus left his wounded lightly guarded at Numistro, with the military tribune Lucius Furius, Propriero, in charge, and proceeded to dog Hannibal's footsteps. He overtook him at Venusia. There, over a number of days, charges were made from the forward post on both sides that led to scrappy infantry and cavalry encounters rather than significant battles, nearly all of them favoring the Romans. But that the armies were marched through Apulia without any noteworthy engagement, since Hannibal would advance at night looking for a site for an ambush, while Marcellus would follow him only in broad daylight and after reconnoitering the route. 3. In Capua, meanwhile, Flaccus had been spending his time selling off the property of the leading citizens and renting out the farmland that had been appropriated by the Roman state, taking grains as rent in all cases. During this process, as if to make sure that Flaccus would not lack grounds for venting his wrath on the Capuans, a fresh piece of villainy that had been secretly developing was brought to light through informers. The Roman rank and file had been removed from the town buildings by Flaccus, who had forced them to build huts for themselves at the gates and by the walls, after a fashion suitable for soldiers. The reason for this was partly so that the houses in the city could be leased along with the farmland, but also because Flaccus feared that the city, with its all too seductive charms, might soften his troops, too, as they had Hannibal's. Now a number of the huts were made of wickerwork and planking, and some were of interlaced reeds covered with straw, everything being almost designed to feed a fire. 170 Capuans, led by the Blosi brothers, plotted together to set fire to all of these at the same time during the night. The affair was divulged by slaves of the Blosius household, and on the proconsul's order the city gates were promptly closed. A signal was given, the soldiers rushed to arms, and all the guilty parties were arrested. Following an intensive investigation, these men were condemned and executed, and the informants were given their freedom and 10,000 asses each. The people of Nuceria and Acerrae now complained that they had nowhere to live. Acerrae having been partly burned and Nuceria destroyed, and Fulvius sent to the Senate in Rome. The people of Acerrae were given leave to rebuild what had been burned. The Nicerians were granted their preferred option of resettling at Atella, and the people of Atella were ordered to move to Calatia. Amidst the many important items that were on the minds of people at this time, some of them positive, some negative, the citadel of Tarentum was not forgotten. Marcus, Ogulnius, and Publius Aquilius set off as a delegation into Etruria to purchase grain that was to be transported to Tarentum. In addition, 1,000 soldiers from the army in the city, an equal number of Romans and allies, were sent to that town with grain to serve in the garrison. 4. Summer was now at an end, and the time for consular elections was close at hand. However, a letter from Marcellus had caused the senators some concern. Marcellus claimed that it was not in the interest of state for him to move a single step away from Hannibal. He was now putting pressure on the Carthaginian, he said, who was running from him and refusing to engage. The senators thus faced a dilemma, taking a consul out of the war just when he was making headway, or else being short of consuls for the coming year. The best option seemed to be to recall the consul Valerius from Sicily, despite the fact that he was outside Italy. On a directive from the Senate, a letter was then sent to Valerius by the urban praetor Lucius Manlius, and it was accompanied by the letter from the consul Marcus Marcellus. From these, Valerius would learn why it was he, rather than his colleague, whom the senators were recalling from his province. At about that time, representatives from King Sphax came to Rome with news of successful battles the king had fought with the Carthaginians. There was no people to whom Sphax was a more implacable enemy than the Carthaginians, they said, and none to whom he was a closer friend than the Romans. He had earlier sent representatives to Gnaeus and Publius Cornelius in Spain, they added, but now he had decided to seek friendship with Rome directly from the source, as it were. The Senate not only responded favorably to the representatives, but also sent its own representatives to the king with gifts. These were Lucius, Ganusius, Publius, Potelius, and Publius Popilius. And the gifts they brought were a purple toga and a purple tunic, a chair of ivory, and a 5-pound golden bowl. The men had further instructions to proceed to the courts of other African kings, and they bore gifts that were to be presented to each of these two, namely, a toga, praetexa, and a golden bowl weighing 3 pounds. In addition, Marcus Atilius and Manius Acilius were sent to Alexandria as a delegation to the royal couple Ptolemy and Cleopatra, to remind them of their ties of friendship with Rome and to renew those ties. As gifts, they brought a toga, a purple tunic, and a chair of ivory for the king, and an embroidered wrap and a purple cloak for the queen. During the summer that witnessed these events, there were numerous prodigies reported from nearby towns and country areas. At Tusculum, it was said that a lamb had been born with its udder full of milk, and also that the top of the temple of Jupiter had been struck by lightning, and its roof almost completely torn off. At Anagnia, at roughly that time, it was claimed that the ground before the city gate had been struck by lightning, and that it burned for a day and a night, although there was nothing to fuel the fire. In addition, birds reportedly abandoned their nests in the trees in the grove of Diana at the crossroads of Anagnia. At Terracina, in the sea not far from the harbor, snakes of amazing size were supposed to have jumped from the water like fish at play. It was said that at Tarquinii a pig had been born with a human face, and that at the grove of Feronia, in the territory of Capina, 4 statues had sweated out copious quantities of blood for a day and a night. By decree of the pontiffs, expiation ceremonies for these prodigies were conducted with full-grown sacrificial animals, and 1 day of prayer was prescribed at the couches in Rome, with a 2nd day at the grove of Feronia, in the territory of Capina. When he received his letter of recall, the consul Marcus Valerius delegated his province and army to the praetor Lucius Cincius, and sent the commander of the fleet, Marcus Valerius Massala, to Africa with a number of his ships. Massala was to conduct raids there, and at the same time gather intelligence on the activities and plans of the Carthaginian people. Valerius himself then set off for Rome with 10 ships, and convened the Senate immediately on his arrival, after a successful voyage. He there gave a report on his achievements, observing that, after almost 60 years of Roman military involvement on land and sea in Sicily, which had often entailed dreadful defeats, he had now brought that province to heel. There was no Carthaginian left in Sicily, he said, and there was not a Sicilian still missing from it. The absentees, who had been driven out by fear, had been restored to their cities and farms, where they were now plowing and sowing. Deserted land was being worked again. It was at last bearing crops for its cultivators, and represented the Roman people's most reliable safeguard for the grain supply in peace and war. After the mutinies, and even others who had served the Roman people were ushered into the Senate, and in fulfillment of consul's promise, all had honors conferred upon them. Mutinies was even made a citizen of Rome, after a bill authorized by Senate was brought before the people by the plebeian tribunes. During that time that this was going on in Rome, Marcus Valerius, reaching the coast of Africa with 50 ships, some time before dawn, made a surprise landing in the territory of Utica. He plundered the area extensively, taking many prisoners, along with other booty of all kinds. He then went back to the ships and made the crossing to Sicily, returning to Lilybaeum 12 days after he left it. The captives were interrogated, and from them a number of facts were ascertained, and a detailed and ordered transcription was made of them for the consul Lavinus, so that he could see how matters stood in Africa. 5,000 Numidians were in Carthage. It was learned with a dynamic young leader, Massinissa, son of Gela. The other fighting men were being hired throughout Africa to be shipped to Hasdrubal in Spain. The goal for Hasdrubal to cross to Italy and link up with Hannibal with the largest possible army and at the earliest possible moment, and the Carthaginians believed that it was in this strategy that victory lay. It was further discovered that a huge armada was being constructed for the recovery of Sicily, and the prisoners believed that it would soon make the crossing. The information was read aloud in the Senate by the consul, and it made such an impression that the House voted that he should not wait for the elections, but appoint a dictator for the supervision of elections and immediately return to his province. But a disagreement held the matter up. The consul insisted that he would, when he was in Sicily, appoint as dictator Marcus Valerius Messala, who was then in command of the fleet, but the senators informed him that the appointment of a dictator outside Roman territory, which was limited to the confines of Italy, was not possible. The plebeian tribune, Marcus Lucretius, now formally laid the matter before the Senate for a ruling, and the Senate decreed that the consul should, before he left the city, put to the people the question of the man they wanted appointed dictator. The consul should then appoint as dictator whomever the people named. If the consul refused, then the praetor should put the question to the people, and in the event of a refusal from him, too, the tribunes should refer the matter to the plebs. The consul did in fact refuse to put to the people a matter which he claimed was his to decide, and he instructed the praetor to do the same. The tribunes then put the question to the plebs, and the plebs decided that Quintus Fulvius, who was at Capua at the time, should be appointed dictator. But on the night before the assembly of the plebs was to be held, the consul slipped furtively away to Sicily. The senators were now left in the lurch, and they voted to send a dispatch to Marcus Claudius, ordering him to come to the assistance of the republic that had been abandoned by his colleague, and to declare as dictator the man who was the people's choice. So it was that Quintus Fulvius was appointed dictator of the consul Marcus Claudius, and by the same resolution of the plebs, the Pontifex Maximus Publius Licinius Crassus was appointed master of horse by the dictator Quintus Fulvius. 6. On his arrival in Rome, the dictator dispatched his legate Gaius Sempronius Blasius, whom he had alongside him in Capua, to the army in his province of Etruria, where he was to replace Gaius Calpurnius, and Calpurnius he summoned by letter to take charge of Capua and his own army there. Fulvius then announced the holding of the elections at the earliest possible date. The electoral process, however, could not be completed because of a dispute that rose between the tribunes and the dictator. The right to vote first had fallen by lot to the junior members of the tribe Galeria, and they had declared Quintus Fulvius and Quintus Fabius their choice as consuls. The other tribes, too, would have been similarly inclined when called on in their routine order. But the plebeian tribunes Gaius and Lucius Aurelius intervened. They insisted that back-to-back offices were unconstitutional, and that the election of a man who was actually presiding over the vote set a much worse precedent still. So, they said, if the dictator accepted his own nomination, they would veto the election. But if other nominations, and not his own, were considered, they would not obstruct the proceedings. The dictator justified the election by appealing to the authority of the Senate, to the decision of the plebeian council, and to various precedents. In the consulship of Gnaeus Servilius, he reminded them the other consul, Gaius Flaminius, had fallen at Trasimene. Then, on senatorial authority, a proposal was brought to the plebs, which the plebs ratified, that the people should have the right, for as long as there was war in Italy, to elect whatever former consuls they pleased, and as often as they wished. He also had precedents supporting the procedure, he said. An old one was the case of Lucius Postumius Megallus, who had been elected consul with Gaius Junius Babolcus in elections over which he himself had been presiding as interrex. A recent one was that of Quintus Fabius, who would certainly not have permitted himself back-to-back consulships had this not been in the public interest. After lengthy wrangling with arguments like this, an agreement was finally reached between the dictator and the tribunes to abide by the decision of the Senate. In the view of the senators, this critical moment for the Republic called for affairs of state to be conducted by veteran commanders who had experience and skill in warfare, and so they declared that they did not favor any delay in the elections. The tribunes acquiesced. The elections were held, and Quintus Fabius Maximus and Quintus Fulvius Flaccus were elected, the former for the fifth and the latter for the fourth time. The praetors were elected next, and these were Lucius Veturius Philo, Titus Quinctius Crispinus, Gaius Hostilius Tubulus, and Gaius Aurunculius. The magistrates for the year elected, Quintus Fulvius resigned his position as dictator. At the end of the summer, a Punic fleet of 40 ships crossed to Sardinia under the command of Hamilcar. It first conducted raids on the farmlands of Olbia. Then, when Publius Manlius Vulso appeared with his army, it sailed to the other side of the island and plundered the gates of Corales, after which it returned to Africa laden with all manner of spoils. A number of Roman priests died that year, and replacements were made. Gaius Servilius was made pontiff in place of Titus Autosilius Crassus, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus, son of Tiberius, was made augur in place of Gaius Attilius Serenus. Likewise, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, son of Tiberius, replaced Tiberius Sempronius Longus, son of Gaius, as decemvir for sacrifices. The Rex Sacrorum, Marcus Marcius, and the chief curio, Marcus Aemilius Papus, also died, but were not replaced in their priesthoods that year. That year saw the appointment of Lucius Veturius Philo and Publius Licinius Crassus, the Pontifex Maximus, as censors. Licinius Crassus had previously been neither consul nor praetor, but made the step from the aedileship directly to the censorship. However, these censors did not revise the roll of senators or conduct any official business. The death of Lucius Veturius preempted this, and Licinius then resigned his post as censor. The Carol Aediles, Lucius Veturius, and Publius Licinius Varus repeated the Roman games for a single day. The plebeian aediles, Quintus Catius and Lucius Porcius Licinus, made a donation of bronze statues, paid for out of money taken in from fines at the temple of Ceres, and they put on the games with considerable grandeur for the resources available in that period. Seven. At the end of the year, Scipio's legate, Gaius Laelius, came to Rome, 33 days after leaving Tarraco, and he attracted large crowds when he entered the city with a train of captives. The following day he was brought before the Senate. There he recounted how New Carthage, capital of Spain, had been captured in one day, and how a number of cities that had defected had been recovered and some new ones drafted into alliance. Information from the prisoners pretty well squared with that in the dispatch, and had been sent by Marcus Valerius Messala. What particularly caused the senators concern was the threat of Hasdrubal's voyage to Italy, when the country could barely stand up to Hannibal and his forces. Laelius was also brought before the popular assembly, where he delivered the same information as he had in the Senate. The Senate proclaimed a single day of religious thanksgiving for Publius Scipio's successes, and instructed Gaius Laelius to go back to Spain as soon as possible with the ships with which he had come. On the basis of many sources, I have placed the capture of New Carthage in this year, though I am not unaware that some have recorded that it was taken the following year. It seemed to me less plausible that Scipio spent an entire year in Spain without actually doing anything. On the 15th of March, Quintus Fabius Maximus and Quintus Fulvius Flaccus became consuls, Fabius for the 5th time and Fulvius for the 4th. On the day on which they entered office, the two were assigned Italy as their sphere of responsibility, but with their authority demarcated by region. Fabius was to operate around Tarentum, Fulvius in Lucania and Bruttium. Marcus Claudius had his imperium extended for a year. In the Praetorian sortition of provinces, Gaius Hostilius Tobulus received the urban jurisdiction, Lucius Veturius Philo, the foreigners' jurisdiction together with Gaul, Titus Quintius Crispinus Capua, and Gaius Aurunculeius Sardinia. The distribution of armies amongst the provinces was as follows. Quintus Fulvius was assigned the 2 legions then under Marcus Valerius Lavinus in Sicily, and Quintus Fabius the legions that Gaius Calpurnius had commanded in Etruria. The army of the city was to move to Etruria, where Gaius Calpurnius would again have charge of that province and its army. Titus Quintius would take charge of Capua and the army that had been under Quintus Fulvius. Gaius Hostilius was to assume from the propraetor Gaius Laetorius command of his province and army, which was then at Ariminum. Marcus Marcellus was assigned the legions with which the consul had been operating. Marcus Valerius and Lucius Cincius who also saw their imperium extended in Sicily, were delegated the army that had fought at Cannae, and they were ordered to make up its numbers with soldiers surviving from the legions of Gnaeus Fulvius. The consuls sought these out and sent them off to Sicily. The men were, in addition, to serve under the same humiliating conditions as the veterans of Cannae, and those troops of Gnaeus Fulvius who had been sent to Sicily by the Senate in its displeasure over a singular incident of flight in battle. In Sardinia, Gaius Aurunculeius was assigned the same legions with which Publius Manlius Volso had carried out his responsibilities there. Publius Sulpicius was given orders to keep watch on Macedonia, with the same legion and fleet as before, with his imperium extended a year. Orders were given for 30 quinqueremes to be sent from Sicily to the consul Quintus Fabius at Tarentum, and the remainder of the fleet it was decided would be used for raids on Africa. Marcus Valerius Lavinius should either sail over in person or, if he chose, send Lucius Cincius or Marcus Valerius Messala instead. In the case of Spain, no changes were made apart from Scipio, and Silanus received extensions of their imperium, not for a year, but until such time as they were recalled by the Senate. Such was the distribution of responsibilities and armies for that year. Although attention was focused on more pressing matters, elections to the post of chief curio, in which a priest to replace Marcus Aemilius had to be chosen, nevertheless aroused an old quarrel. The patricians declared that the nomination of Gaius Mamilius Attalus, the sole candidate from the plebs, should be disallowed, for they said nobody outside the patrician order had held that priesthood before. An appeal was made to the tribunes, who referred the question to the Senate, and the Senate granted the people the authority to decide the case. So it was that Gaius Mamilius Attalus became the first man from the plebeian order elected chief curio. The Pontifex Maximus Publius Licinius also obliged Gaius Valerius Flaccus to be inaugurated as Flamen of Jupiter, against his will, and Gaius Laetorius replaced Quintus Mucius Scaevola as Decemvir for sacrifices on Scaevola's death. I would have been glad to say nothing about the motive for Flamen before forced to accept his position, had it not been a case of a bad reputation turning into a good one. It was because of a youth of shiftlessness and dissipation that Gaius Flaccus was taken up as Flamen by the Pontifex Maximus. Publius Licinius, though the young man was hated by his brother and other relatives for these very shortcomings. When his religious and ceremonial duties became his preoccupation, he swiftly put aside his old character, to the point that none of the younger generation enjoyed greater esteem or approval amongst the leading senators, whether they were family relations or strangers. The general acceptance of his new reputation gave him a justifiable self-confidence, and that prompted him to reclaim a right that, thanks to the disreputable character of earlier Flamens, had elapsed over the years, namely, entry into the Senate. Flaccus went into the Senate house only to have the praetor Publius Licinius usher him out, and he appealed to the plebeian tribunes. As Flamen, he was actually reclaiming a time-honored right of his priesthood, which was, he said, granted to the office of Flamen, along with the toga praxtexta and curule chair. The praetor's position was that a right should be based not on outdated proceedings from ancient history, but on recent practice relating to the matter in question, and no Flamen or Jupiter had exercised that right in the time either of their fathers or their grandfathers. The tribunes ruled that, as the privilege had fallen into disuse thanks to the apathy of some Flamens, the loss should fall on those individuals themselves, not on the priesthood. And so, with no opposition even from the praetor, the tribunes escorted the Flamen into the Senate, to the great approval of the senators and plebs. All were of the opinion, however, that the Flamen had gained his end more from the probity of his life than from the right of the office. Before going to their provinces, the consuls raised 2 city legions to make up the numbers required for the other armies. The consul Fulvius assigned to the legate Gaius Fulvius Flaccus, who was his brother, and the responsibility of taking the old city army to Etruria and bringing back to Rome the legions then stationed in Etruria. The consul Fabius, on his side, instructed his son Quintus Maximus to seek out the remnants of Fulvius's army, some 4,344 men, and lead them to the consul Marcus Valerius in Sicily, and then to take over from Valerius 2 legions and 30 quinqueremes. The removal of these legions from the island did nothing to weaken the defense of the province in terms of real or perceived strength. An excellent job had been done of bringing the 2 old legions up to strength, and Valerius also had a large force of Numidian deserters. An excellent job had been done of bringing the two old legions up to strength, and Valerius also had a large force of Numidian deserters, both infantry and cavalry. In addition, he recruited Sicilians with fighting experience who had been in Epipsides' army or that of Carthaginians. By adding these foreign auxiliaries to individual Roman legions, Valerius kept up the appearance of two armies. He ordered Lucius Cincius to use one for the defense of the part of the island which had repressed By adding these foreign auxiliaries to individual Roman legions, Valerius kept up the appearance of two armies. He ordered Lucius Cincius to use one of the defense for one. He ordered Lucius Cincius to use one for the defense of the part of the island which had represented Hiero's kingdom, and the other he employed himself to defend the rest, once demarcated into Roman and Punic spheres of power. He also split his fleet of 70 ships so that protection could be afforded to the entire length of the coastline. Valerius made a point of traveling through the province with Mutinese cavalry to visit farms and take note of what was cultivated and what was not, and using that as grounds for commending or criticizing landowners. Thanks to such diligence on his part, the grain yield was great enough for him to send some to Rome, and also transport some to Cattina for provisioning the army that would be spending the summer around Tarentum. In fact, the soldiers shipped to Sicily, most of them of Latin status or allies, nearly proved to be the cause of some serious unrest. Great and critical events, it is true, often arise from the insignificant ones. Some grumbling had begun amongst the Latins and the allies in their meetings. For 9 years they were saying they had been drained by having to raise troops and supply their pay. Almost every year they faced some terrible defeat in battle, and their men were either being killed in the field or carried off by disease. A compatriot conscripted by the Roman was more loss to them than one captured by the Carthaginian, they said. By the enemy he was sent home without ransom, but by the Romans he was taken out of Italy into something more aptly termed exile than military service. For 7 years, the soldier who had fought at Cannae had now been growing old in that exile, and he would die before the enemy, right now at the height of his strength, left Italy. With old soldiers not coming home and new ones being conscripted, there would be soon no one left. So they said they should refuse the Roman people what the circumstances were shortly going to refuse them anyway, and do so now before reaching extreme depopulation and poverty. If the Romans saw the allies in agreement on this, they would certainly consider making peace with the Carthaginians. Otherwise, Italy would never be free of war as long as Hannibal lived. Such were their discussions at their meetings. The Roman people then had 30 colonies. Since all had delegations in Rome at the time, 12 told the consuls that they lacked the wherewithal to supply fighting men and cash. The 12 were Ardea, Nepte, Sutrium, Alba, Carcioli, Sora, Suessa, Circe, Setia, Callis, Narnia, and Interama. The consuls were taken back by the surprising turn of events, and they tried to dissuade the delegates from such a terrible idea. They thought that they would have greater success with censure and reproaches than with a gentle approach, and they kept telling them that what the delegates had dared express to the consuls would not bring themselves to utter in the Senate. For that would not simply be a refusal of military obligations, they explained, but outright defection from the Roman people. They told them that they should promptly return to their colonies and hold discussions with their people, behaving as if the subject had not been broached, for so far they had only discussed, and not taken, such a momentous step. They should remind their people that they are not Capuans or Tarentines, but Romans, that they were of Roman descent, and that they had been cut out from Rome into the colonies, and into land taken in war, in order to propagate the Roman race. They owed the Romans as much as children owed to their parents. If they had any sense of duty, or any memory of their mother city of old, so they should consider the matter afresh, for their earlier reckless deliberations would only lead to betraying Roman power and handing victory to Hannibal. The consuls pressed these arguments in turn for quite some time, but the delegates remained unmoved. They had no suggestion to take home, they said, and their Senate had no new business to discuss, for they had neither soldiers for conscription nor money to be given as soldiers' pay. The consuls saw that they were adamant, and they reported the matter to the Senate. Here such panic struck the members that most said the empire was finished, that other colonies and the allies would follow suit, and that they had all abandoned together to betray the city of Rome to Hannibal. The consuls encouraged and reassured the Senate. They said the other colonies would remain as loyal and reliable as before, and even those who had failed in their duty would be brought to respect Roman power, if envoys were sent around those particular colonies to chasten them rather than plead with them. The consuls were then given senatorial leave to take any action or measure they thought to be in the interest of the state. After first sounding the feelings of the other colonies, they summoned representatives of those colonies and asked if they had any soldiers mobilized from the register. Okay, I'm just going to back up here. I want to reread this, the activity in the Senate, beginning in chapter 9, and then we'll go on from there. So just bear with me here. In fact, the soldiers shipped to Sicily, most of them of Latin status or allies, nearly proved to be the cause of some serious unrest. Great and critical events, it is true, often arise from the insignificant ones. Some grumbling had begun amongst the Latins and the allies in their meetings. For 9 years
They were saying they had been drained by having to raise troops and supply their pay. Almost every year they faced some terrible defeat in battle, and their men were either being killed in the field or carried off by disease. A compatriot conscripted by the Roman was more loss to them than one captured by the Carthaginian, they said. By the enemy he was sent home without ransom, but by the Romans he was taken out of Italy into something more aptly termed exile than military service. For 7 years the soldier who had fought at Cannae had now been growing old in that exile, and he would die before the enemy, right now at the height of his strength, left Italy. With old soldiers not coming home and new ones being conscripted, there would soon be no one left. So they said they should refuse the Roman people what the circumstances were shortly going to refuse them anyway, and do so now before reaching extreme depopulation and poverty. If the Romans saw the allies in agreement on this, they would certainly consider making peace with the Carthaginians. Otherwise, Italy would never be free of war as long as Hannibal lived. Such were their discussions at the meetings. The Roman people then had 30 colonies. Since all had delegations in Rome at the time, 12 told the consuls that they lacked the wherewithal to supply fighting men and cash. The 12 were Ardea, Nepete, Sutrium, Alba, Carcioli, Sora, Suessa, Circe, Setia, Callis, Narnia, and Interama. The consuls were taken back by this surprising turn of events, and they tried to dissuade the delegates from such a terrible idea. They thought they would have greater success with censure and reproaches than with a gentle approach, and they kept telling them that what the delegates had dared express to the consuls should not bring themselves to utter in the Senate. For that would not simply be a refusal of military obligations, they explained, but outright defection from the Roman people. They told them that they should promptly return to their colonies and hold discussions with their people, behaving as if the subject had not been broached, for so far they had only discussed and not taken such a momentous step. They should remind the people that they were not Capuans or Tarentines but Romans, that they were of Roman descent, and that they had been sent out from Rome into the colonies and into land taken in war, in order to propagate the Roman race. They owed the Romans as much as children owed to their parents. If they had any sense of duty to, or any memory of, their mother city of old, so they should consider the matter afresh, for their earlier reckless deliberations would only lead to betraying Roman power and handing victory to Hannibal. The consuls pressed these arguments in turn for quite some time, but the delegates remained unmoved. They had no suggestion to take home, they said, and their Senate had no new business to discuss, for they had neither soldiers for conscription nor money to be given as soldiers' pay. The consuls saw they were adamant, and they reported the matter to the Senate. Here such panic struck the members that most said the empire was finished, that other colonies and allies would follow suit, and that they had all banded together to betray the city of Rome to Hannibal. 10. The consuls encouraged and reassured the Senate. They said the other colonies would remain as loyal and reliable as before, and even those who had failed in their duty would be brought to respect Roman power. If envoys were sent around those particular colonies to chasten them rather than plead with them, the consuls were then given senatorial leave to take any action or measure they thought to be in the interest of the state. After first sounding the feelings of the other colonies, they summoned representatives of those colonies and asked if they had any soldiers mobilized from the register. Speaking for the 18 or other colonies, Marcus Sextilius of Fregellae replied that there were indeed men mobilized from the register. In fact, he said, the colonies would supply more if more were needed, and would also assiduously carry out any other instructions or wishes of the Roman people. They had no shortage of resources for that, he said, and of loyalty they had a superabundance. The consuls prefaced their reply by saying that they felt the praise and representatives would receive from them personally was insufficient, and that all the senators should offer them thanks in the Senate House, and they instructed them to follow them into the Senate. The Senate addressed to them a decree couched in the most respectful language, and directed the consuls to bring them before the popular assembly as well. There the consuls were to mention the many distinguished benefits these colonies had conferred upon them and their ancestors, and refer in particular to their recent service of the state. Not even today, after the passage of so many generations, should these people be passed over in silence, or deprived of their meed of praise. They were the peoples of Signia, Norba, Saticula, Fregellae, Luceria, Venusia, Brundisium, Hadria, Firmum, and Arum-Inum, on the Tyrrhenian Sea, Pontia, Paestum, and Cosa, and inland, Beneventum, Acernia, Spoletium, Placentia, and Cremona. As a result of the assistance provided by these colonies, the power of the Roman people stood firm at that time, and they were officially thanked in the Senate and the popular assembly. As for the 12 other colonies, they refused to heed the requisition. The senators ordered that no mention be made of them. Their representatives were not to be dismissed, held back, or addressed by the consuls. A silent reprimand of this kind seemed most appropriate to the dignity of the Roman people. As the consuls were making all of the other necessary preparations for the war, the decision was taken to withdraw the gold raised by the 5% tax, which was being kept in reserve in the inner treasury to meet emergencies. Approximately 4,000 pounds of gold were withdrawn, and from this sum the consuls and proconsuls Marcus Marcellus and Publius Sulpicius, and the praetor Lucius Veturius, who had drawn Gaul as his province, were each given 500 pounds. A further 100 pounds was given to the consul Fabius to be transported to the citadel of Tarentum. The rest of the gold they used to contract out, for ready money, the provision of clothing for the army that was winning renown for itself and its commander in its operations in Spain. 11. It was further decided that before the consuls left the city there should be expiatory ceremonies for the various prodigies. The following had been struck by lightning: a statue of Jupiter and a tree close to the temple on the Alban Mount, a grove at Ostia, the city wall, the temple of Fortuna at Capua, and the city wall and the gate at Sinusia. There were also reports that the water of the Alban lake had flowed with blood, and that at Rome, in the sanctuary of the temple of Thors Fortuna, a statuette on the goddess's garland fell of its own accord from her head into her hand. It was well established that at Privernum an ox had talked and a vulture had swooped down on a shop in the Forum when it was crowded, and that at Sinuessa a child of indeterminate sex was born, part male, part female, generally called androgynous. Again. It was well established that at Privernum an ox had talked and a vulture had swooped down on a shop in the Forum when it was crowded, and that in Sinuessa a child of indeterminate sex was born, part male, part female, generally called androgynous, a Greek term, as often Greek being easier for the formation of compound words. Milk had fallen as rain, and a boy had been born with an elephant's head. Full-grown victims were used for the expiation of these prodigies, and there was a proclamation enjoining public ceremonies at all the couches, and one day of public prayer. It was also decreed that the praetor Gaius Hostilius should promise games for Apollo in a vow and celebrate them, just as they had been promised and celebrated in recent years. At that time, too, the consul Quintus Fulvius held the voting assembly for election of censors. The censors elected were two men who had not been consuls, Marcus Cornelius Cethegus and Publius Sempronius Tuditanus. With senatorial authorization, a motion was brought to the plebs, which gave its consent, that the two censors should lease out the farmland of Capua. Revision of state membership was held up by infighting amongst the censors over the selection of Senate leader. The prerogative of choosing the leader fell by lot to Sempronius, but Cornelius insisted that they follow the practice handed down to them from their forefathers of choosing as leader the man who, amongst all ex-censors still alive, had been the first to hold office. That man was Titus Manlius Torquatus. Sempronius claimed that the gods had allotted him the right to choose, and they had thereby also given him the right to choose freely. He was going to exercise his own judgment in doing this, and would select Quintus Fabius Maximus, whom he could conclusively prove, even to Hannibal's satisfaction, to be, at that time, the leading man in the Roman state. After a long war of words, Sempronius' colleague gave way, and the consul, Quintus Fabius Maximus, was selected as leader in the Senate by Sempronius. After that, the rest of the Senate membership was revised, and 8 men were struck off, including Marcus Caecilius Metellus, the man infamous for having advocated leaving Italy after the defeat at Cannae. That same issue was used in attaching censure to equestrians too, though those touched by that particular scandal were very few. Knights who were former members of the legions at Cannae, and were then serving in Sicily, and they were numerous, all had their horses taken from them. The censors also added a time factor to this harsh punishment, refusing to recognize past service in the case of individuals who had served with public horses, and stipulating that they must all serve 10 seasons with their own horses. The censors also rooted out a large number who should have been serving in the cavalry, and they reduced to the grade of poll taxpayer all who had been 17 years of age when the war started, but had failed to serve. After that, they put out for contract rebuilding projects for the area around the Forum, destroyed by fire, 7 shops, the food market, and the royal atrium. 12. When all necessary business had been completed in Rome, the consuls left for the war. Fulvius left first, and went ahead to Capua. Fabius followed a few days later. Fabius pleaded with his colleague in person, and with Marcellus by letter, to detain Hannibal by putting the utmost pressure on him. while Fabius himself was mounting his attack on Tarentum. The enemy had now been driven back everywhere, Fabius told them, and had nowhere to make a stand and no secure base behind him. If Tarentum were taken from him, he would have no reason to remain in Italy. Fabius also sent a message to the commander of the garrison in Rhegium that had been stationed there by the consul Lavinus as a buffer against the Bruti. The garrison was 8,000 strong, mostly men from Agatharna, as noted above, who had been shipped over from Sicily, and they were people who had been used to a life of larceny. To their numbers had been added Brutian deserters from the locality, men just as reckless and just as desperate. Fabius ordered the commander to take this band out, first to raid the lands of the Bruti, and then to assault the city of Colonia. The men carried out their orders with passion rather than zest, and after robbing and chasing off the farmers, they proceeded with an all-out assault on the city. Marcellus was galvanized into action both by the consul's letter and by his conviction that no Roman general was as good a match for Hannibal as he. As soon as there was plenty of forage in the fields, he left his winter quarters and met Hannibal in the area of Canusium. The Carthaginian leader was trying to induce the citizens of Canusium to defect, but on hearing of Marcellus's approach, he struck camp. The country here was open, with no cover for an ambush, and so Hannibal proceeded to fall back towards a wooded region. Marcellus dogged his footsteps and kept pitching camp close to him. The work of establishing camp complete, he would immediately deploy his legions for battle. Hannibal would skirmish with him, using his cavalry only by individual squadrons, and only the javelin throwers of his infantry. But he felt total engagement was unnecessarily risky. He was, however, drawn into the confrontation he was trying to avoid. Hannibal had been marching by night, and Marcellus overtook him in an area that was flat and open. He tried to pitch camp, but Marcellus frustrated him by attacking the men engaged in the work on all sides. The result was a pitched battle, with all their forces engaged, and when night was approaching, they parted on equal terms. The camps, just a short distance from each other, were hurriedly fortified before darkness fell. At dawn the next day, Marcellus led his forces into the field, and Hannibal did not decline the fight. He addressed his men at length, telling them to remember Trasimene and Cannae, and smash the insolence of the enemy. They were constantly pressing and goading them, he declared, never letting them march on in peace or pitch camp, never letting them take a breath or look around. Every day they were obliged to see before them, with the rising sun, a Roman army on the plains. If the enemy left just one battle bloodied, he would be more tempered and restrained in his future operations. Animated by these exhortations, and at the same time sick and tired of the insolence of a foe who every day was pressuring and provoking them, the Carthaginians went into battle with great spirit. The fight went on for more than 2 hours. Then, on the Roman side, the allied troops on the right and the elite contingent of allies began to falter. When Marcellus saw that, he brought the 18th Legion into the front line. While some were falling back in fear and others were slow in coming into line, the whole formation was thrown into turmoil, then quite clearly beaten back, and, fear vanquishing their sense of honor, they began to flee. In the action and the flight, about 2,700 citizens and allies lost their lives, including 4 Roman centurions and 2 military tribunes, Marcus Licinius and Marcus Helvius. 4 military standards were lost from the allied contingent that had begun the flight, and 2 from the legion that had come to the front when the allies were given ground. 13. On his return to camp, Marcellus delivered an address to his men so biting and caustic that they found their angry commander's words even harder to take than a losing engagement that had lasted the entire day. In the circumstances, I can at least praise and thank the immortal gods for one thing, he said. Our victorious foe did not actually attack the camp itself when you were making your panic-stricken dash for the rampart and the gates. I am sure you would have deserted the camp with as much terror as you quit the fight. What fear, what terror suddenly came over you to make you forget who you were and against whom you were fighting? These are obviously the same enemies you spent last summer defeating in battle and then chasing from the field after defeating them. The same men whose tracks you have dogged the last few days as day and night, they fled before you. The men whom you wore down in skirmishes, and whom yesterday you would allow neither to march nor to pitch camp. I pass over the things on which you pride yourselves, but I will mention something that ought to make you feel shame and regret. I mean, of course, that yesterday you broke off the fight when it was a drawn battle. What did last night do to you, or what today? Has there been some lessening of your forces, or some increase in theirs? For I do not seem to be talking to my own army, or to Roman soldiers. Only your bodies and weapons are the same. Had your spirit remained the same, would the enemy have seen your backs, or robbed any maniple of or cohort of its standards? Until now the enemy was priding himself on cutting Roman legions to shreds, but you, on this day, have for the first time given him the glory of actually putting a Roman army to flight. At this, a cry went up, begging forgiveness for the day's performance, and asking him to put his soldiers' courage to the test again whenever he wished. "All right, men, I will put it to the test," he replied. "I shall tomorrow lead you out into battle, so that, as winners, not losers, you can gain the pardon you seek." Marcellus then ordered the cohorts that had lost their standards to be kept on barley rations, and the centurions of the maniples whose standards had been lost were instructed to stand to one side, swords unsheathed and belts removed. He also called for everybody, infantry and cavalry, to assemble under arms the following day. The meeting was then dismissed, the men admitting that the tongue-lashing they had received was well deserved, and that on the day none but their commander had shown himself a man in the Roman battle line. Now they must satisfy him, either dying themselves or winning a superlative victory. The next day, as ordered, they appeared armed and equipped. The commander complimented them and announced that he was going to lead into the front line the men with whom the flight had begun the previous day, and the cohorts that had lost their standards. He was now making a formal declaration, he said, that they all had to fight and win individually and together, doing their best to prevent the previous day's defeat being reported at Rome before the day's victory. They were then ordered to take food to build up their strength, so that they would have sufficient stamina in the battle, if the battle were prolonged. When all was said and done to boost the men's morale, they proceeded to the field. 14. When Hannibal was brought the news, he declared, "Clearly we have an enemy who can tolerate neither good fortune nor bad. Winning, he puts fierce pressure on his defeated foe. Losing, he renews the fight with his conquerors." With that, he called for the trumpet signal and led out his troops. The fighting was considerably fiercer on both sides than on the previous day. The Carthaginians were struggling to secure the glory won the day before, the Romans to wipe out their disgrace. On the Roman side, the left allied contingent and the cohorts that had lost their standards were fighting in the front line, and the 18th Legion was deployed on the right wing. The legates, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus and Gaius Claudius Nero, commanded the wings, and Marcellus kept the center solid by his presence, giving encouragement and taking note of performance. On Hannibal's side, the Spaniards were in the front line, and these represented the main strength in the entire Carthaginian army. After a long period of indecisive combat, Hannibal ordered elephants to be brought to the front, thinking that this might create havoc and panic in the enemy. And indeed, the beast did at first bring chaos to the troop deployment and the ranks, trampling down or else scattering in terror those in their vicinity. They had actually created an opening in the line at one point. In fact, the flight from there would have been more widespread had not the military tribune Gaius Decimus Flavius seized the standard of the first maniple, Hastati, and called upon the maniple under that standard to follow him. Decimus took the men to the point at which the beasts crowded together were causing the greatest trouble, and told them to hurl their spears at them. All their weapons stuck fast in their target, for it was not difficult at close range to hit such huge bodies, so densely packed together. Not all the beasts were wounded, but those with weapons in their backs turned to run, and in so doing, such being their undependable nature, stampeded the uninjured animals as well. At that point, it was no longer a matter of one maniple hurling javelins. Now every single soldier was doing so, as long as he was able to keep up with the herd of fleeing elephants. When an elephant is startled, its fear drives it on with a fury that cannot be controlled by the driver on its back, and the beasts now charged their own side with all the more force, creating greater carnage than they had amongst the enemy. The line was in chaos where the animals charged through. The Roman infantry pushed forward at that point, and it did not take much of a fight to force back the disordered and panic-stricken Carthaginians. Then Marcellus sent cavalry in pursuit of the fugitives, and the chase stopped only when these were driven in consternation back into the camp. For apart from everything else that was causing panic and alarm, it so happened that 2 elephants had collapsed right in the gateway, and the Carthaginian soldiers dashed back to their camp had to be made over the ditch and the rampart. It was there that the enemy suffered the greatest loss of life, with some 8,000 men killed and 5 elephants. But for the Romans, it was no bloodless victory either. Roughly 1,700 men were killed from the 2 legions, and of the allies, more than 1,300. The number of the wounded citizens and allies was very high. Hannibal struck camp the following night. Marcellus wanted to follow him, but the large number of his wounded prevented him from doing so. 15. Scouts were sent out to track Hannibal's column, and they brought news the following day that he was heading for Bruttium. It was at about this time that the Hirpini, the Lucani, and the people of Volsae capitulated to the consul Quintus Fulvius, surrendering to him the garrisons of Hannibal in their cities. They were welcomed with kind words by the consul, who merely reprimanded them for their past mistakes. The Brutii, too, were given similar hopes of pardon after the brothers Vibius and Passius, who were by far the most distinguished members of their tribe, came with a request for the same conditions of surrender as the Lucanians had been given. The consul Quintus Fabius stormed the town of Manduria in the territory of the Salentini, taking about 4,000 prisoners and a considerable amount of other booty as well. From there Fabius left for Tarentum, where he established his camp right at the harbor entrance, putting to use the ships that Lavinius had kept to safeguard his supplies. He loaded some with engines and the tackle used for assaulting city walls, and others he equipped with catapults, rocks, and every kind of projectile. He equipped the freighters in his way too, and not just those propelled by oars, so that some of his men could bring the engines and ladders up to the walls, while others could at long range inflict wounds on the enemy defenders on the fortifications. These ships were equipped and readied for an attack on the city from the open sea. And in fact, the sea was clear of the enemy, the Punic fleet having been transferred to Corcyra when Philip was preparing for his attack on the Aetolians. Meanwhile, in Bruttium, the forces besieging Caulonia, fearing a surprise attack from Hannibal, withdrew to some higher ground before his arrival. This safeguarded them from immediate attack, but offered them no other advantage. During this siege of Tarentum, Fabius was helped on his way to great success by a trivial circumstance. The Tarentines had a garrison composed of Bruttians that had been supplied by Hannibal, and the garrison commander was deeply in love with a young woman whose brother was in the army of the consul Fabius. In a letter from his sister, the brother was informed of her new relationship with a rich foreigner, who was very well respected amongst his people. This now made him hopeful that the lover would be driven to any lengths by his sister, and he informed the consul of his hopes. Fabius thought this was not simply wishful thinking, and the brother was ordered to go over to Tarentum posing as a deserter. There, through his sister, he struck up a relationship with the commander. At first, he discreetly probed the man's feelings, and then, when he had evidence enough of his fecklessness, he used the woman's charms to drive him into betraying the post he had been assigned to guard. A plan of action and the timing were established, and a soldier, surreptitiously dispatched at night from the city along a path between the Tarentine outposts, reported to the consul that what had transpired and what steps had been agreed on for the future. At the first watch, Fabius gave the signal to the men in the citadel and to those standing watch over the harbor. He himself made his way around the harbor and, unobserved, took up a position in the eastern area of the town. Then trumpets blared out simultaneously from the citadel and from the harbor, and ships that had been brought to shore from the open sea, and shouting and an enormous racket was deliberately raised at every point where the danger was actually at a minimum. The consul, meanwhile, held back his men in silence. Now Democritus, the former naval commander, happened to be in charge in that particular sector. Democritus saw that all was quiet around him, whereas there was a noisy commotion in the other areas of town, with the shouting that sometimes goes up when a city is taken. He feared that the consul was actually on the attack and initiating combat, while he was himself doing nothing, and so he led his force over to the citadel, the source of the most alarming noise of all. Fabius judged from the time that had elapsed, and the silence had fallen, that the defensive troops had been withdrawn from that point. For whereas, shortly before, there had been the ring of voices that were rousing soldiers and calling them to arms, now no voice came from there at all. He therefore had ladders advanced to the section of the wall at which, according to the report of the man who had negotiated the betrayal, the Bruttian cohort was on guard duty. It was there that the wall was taken first, the Bruti helping and welcoming the Romans who passed over the fortifications into the city. After that, the closest gate was broken down so the main body of the troops could be admitted. Then, at about the break of day, a cry went up, and the Romans, meeting no armed resistance, made their way to the forum, and now they drew upon themselves the combined onslaught of all who had been engaged in fighting in the area of the citadel or the harbor.
The fighting that broke out at the entrance to the forum was more violent than it was sustained. The Tarentines were not on par with the Romans in courage, weaponry, and military expertise, or in vigor and physical strength. As a result, after simply throwing their javelins, they turned in flight almost before coming to close quarters with their foe, and slipped away along city streets with which they were familiar, to their own homes or those of friends. Two of their officers, Nico and Democritus, went down fighting bravely. Philomenes, who had been responsible for the betrayal of the city to Hannibal, galloped away from the battle. His horse was shortly afterwards recognized, wandering aimlessly through the city, but his body was nowhere to be found. It was commonly thought that he had fallen headlong from his mount into an open well. The commander of the Punic garrison, Carthalo, laid down his arms, but as he was coming to the consul to remind him of ties of hospitality between their fathers, a soldier met him and killed him. There was indiscriminate slaughter of the armed and unarmed in every quarter, and the Carthaginians and Tarentines alike. Even the Bruti were killed in large numbers throughout the city, perhaps by mistake, or possibly because of the long-standing hatred towards them, or perhaps it was to snuff out the rumor of betrayal, and make it look as if the city had rather been captured by force of arms. After the carnage, the Romans scattered to ransack the city. It is said that 30,000 slaves were captured, a huge quantity of silver in plate and coin, 3,080 pounds of gold, and the statues and paintings almost to rival the artwork of Syracuse. But Fabius showed more strength of character in passing up booty of that sort than Marcellus had. When a secretary asked him what he wanted done with some colossal statues, they were gods, each with his appropriate clothing, represented as fighting in battle. Fabius gave orders for the people of Tarentum to be left their angry gods. The wall separating the city from its citadel was then pulled down and demolished. While this was taking place in Tarentum, Hannibal had accepted the surrender of the troops who had been blockading Colonia. Then, hearing that Tarentum was under attack, he drove his column along rapidly day and night, but during the dash to bring assistance he heard of the city's capture. "The Romans have their Hannibal, too," he said. "We have lost Tarentum the same way we took it." However, not to appear to have turned back with his force like a man in flight, Hannibal pitched camp just where he had halted, some 5 miles from the city, and after remaining there a few days, he withdrew to Metapontum. From there, he sent to Metapontine citizens to Fabius in Tarentum, with a letter from the leading men of the city. The men were to accept a guarantee from the consul that they would receive an amnesty for their earlier actions, if they betrayed Metapontum to him, along with its Punic garrison. Fabius, assuming the offer they brought to be genuine, fixed a date for coming to Metapontum, and gave the men a letter to be taken to their leaders. The letter was then brought to Hannibal. Hannibal was pleased with the success of his trick, finding that not even Fabius had proven immune to his cunning.
and he laid an ambush not far distant from Metapontum. Fabius took the auspices before leaving Tarentum, and time and again the birds would not give him favourable signs. He also consulted the gods with the sacrifice of an animal, and was told by the priest that he must be on his guard against treachery on the enemy's part, and against an ambush. When Fabius thus failed to arrive on the prearranged date, the citizens of Metapontum were sent back to him to coax him, if he hesitated to come. They were arrested on the spot, and fearing a more intensive investigation, they revealed the trap.
In Spain, Publius Scipio had spent the entire winter trying to enlist the support of the natives, partly with gifts and partly by restoring their hostages and prisoners of war. Now, at the start of the summer, during which these events were taking place in Italy, a distinguished Spanish chieftain, Edesco, came to see him. Edesco's wife and children were in the hands of the Romans, but something quite apart from that had also brought him, namely, that virtually spontaneous shift of sympathy that had turned all Spain towards the Romans, and away from the rule of the Carthaginian. It was the same thing that prompted in Dibullus and Mandonius, undoubtedly the leading men in all Spain, to take all the forces of their countrymen, abandon Hasdrubal, and withdraw to the hills overlooking his camp, from which a retreat could safely be made to the Romans along the unbroken chain of mountains. It was the same thing that prompted in Dibullus and Mondonius, undoubtedly the leading men in all of Spain, to take all the forces of their countrymen, abandon Hasdrubal, and withdraw to the hills overlooking his camp. From which a retreat could safely be made to the Romans along the unbroken chain of mountains. Hasdrubal saw that his enemy forces were increasing by leaps and bounds, while his own were only decreasing, and he also realized that, if he failed to bring off some bold stroke, his numbers would only continue to disastrous decline. He therefore decided to engage at the earliest opportunity. Scipio was even keener to fight. His success had increased his confidence, and he also preferred to do battle with a single commander and a single army before the enemy armies could join up, than to face them together. However, even supposing he had to fight a number of armies simultaneously, he had found a way of increasing his troop numbers. He observed that his ships were serving no purpose because the entire Spanish coastline was now clear of Punic fleets, and so, beaching his vessels at Tarraco, he combined their crews with his land forces, and he had plenty of weapons, those captured at New Carthage as well as those that he had manufactured by the large numbers of tradesmen whom he had kept interned after the city's capture. Since Laelius, without whom he was unwilling to initiate any important action, had also returned from Rome, Scipio left Tarraco at the beginning of spring with these troops, and began to advance on the enemy. He was making his way over territory that was completely pacified, with allies escorting him or welcoming him as he passed through the lands of each tribe, when he was met by Indibulus and Mandonius and their troops. Indibulus addressed Scipio on behalf of the two, with no trace of the uncouth and crude language of a barbarian, but with modesty and dignity, and he was more inclined to justify their defection to Rome as being necessary than to boast about having seized the earliest opportunity for it. He knew, he said,
that amongst one's old allies the word turncoat aroused hatred, and amongst new ones suspicion, and he did not object to this general tendency amongst men, if it was the motive for the desertion, and not the term itself, that produced this twofold antipathy. He then gave an account of his and Mandonius's services to the Carthaginian commanders, of the Carthaginians' greed and arrogance, and the injustices of all kinds inflicted on the two of them and their people. Up to that point, theirs had been merely a physical presence on the Carthaginian side, he said, but their heart had long been on the side on which they thought there was respect for what was just and right. People who cannot endure the violence and injustice of men also seek refuge as suppliants with the gods, he added, and all they asked of Scipio now was that their defection be seen as neither unconscionable or creditable. He should gauge the value of their service on the basis of the qualities he found in them from personal experience from that day on. That was just what he was going to do, replied the Roman commander, and he would not regard as turncoats men who did not think an alliance binding, when it was based on no respect for obligations, human or divine. Their wives and children were then brought before them and restored to them, as they wept tears of joy, and that day the two leaders were offered Scipio's hospitality. The following day their assurances were accepted with the conclusion of a treaty, and they were sent off to bring up their troops. Following that, the Romans shared their camp, and with them until under their guidance they reached the enemy. 18. The nearest Carthaginian army, that of Hasdrubal, was close to the city of Bacula, and here the Carthaginians had cavalry outposts stationed before the camp. The skirmishers, the advanced troops, and the men at the head of the column attacked the outpost as they were coming off the march, and before choosing a spot for their camp, and they made the attack with such contempt that the level of morale on each side was readily apparent. The Carthaginian cavalry was driven back into the camp in panic-stricken flight, and the Roman advance almost reached the gates. In fact, that day the Romans pitched camp with their appetite for the fight merely whetted. During the night Hasdrubal pulled his troops back to a hill with a broad plateau on its summit. There was a river to his rear, and before him, and on his flanks, a kind of steep slope hedged his entire position. Below him there was another piece of even ground, with a gentle gradient, and that too was bordered by a second steep slope, no easier to climb than the other. The next day Hasdrubal saw the enemy line standing before their camp, and he sent his Numidian cavalry and his Balearic and African light infantry down to this lower flatland. Scipio rode around his ranks and standards, pointing out to his men an enemy who he said had abandoned all hope of fighting on the level ground, and were now trying to hold the hills. All that enabled them to stand in sight of the Romans was their confidence in their position, not in their fighting ability and weapons. But he continued, New Carthage had had walls that were higher, and those the Roman soldier had scaled. Hills had proved no barrier to his weapons, nor had a citadel or even the sea. The high ground they had taken would serve their enemies one purpose only, to make them jump over cliffs and precipices to achieve their escape. But that path of flight he would close off for them too, he said. And he then gave orders to two cohorts, one to hold the entrance to the valley through which the river ran, and the other to maintain a blockade on the road that led from the city into the country along the hillside. Scipio himself took the light armored troops that had driven back the enemy outpost the previous day and led them against the enemy light infantry, who were standing on the brow of the lower slope. At first they advanced over rough terrain, with nothing obstructing them but the difficulty of the path. Then they came within range of the enemy, and a huge mass of weapons of all kinds immediately poured down on them. They retaliated by hurling stones they found on the spot. They were scattered about in profusion, and nearly all of the size for throwing, and the soldiers were joined in this by the crowd of camp followers who were amongst the fighting men. The climb was hard, and the men were all but buried under the showers of weapons and stones, but thanks to their experience in scaling walls and their sheer determination, those at the front reached the top. The enemy here were light-armed skirmishers, men protected by their distance from the foe, avoiding combat as they hurled their weapons from afar. But they were also undependable in fighting hand to hand at close quarters. So, as soon as the foremost Romans gained some level ground on which they could firmly plant their feet, they drove them from their position and forced them back against the battle line that was standing on the higher ground, causing severe losses in the process. Scipio then ordered his triumphant men to advance up the hill against the center of the enemy line, and he divided the rest of his troops between himself and Laelius. Laelius he ordered to proceed to the right, moving around the hill until he found a way up with a gentler slope, and he himself advanced a short distance around to the left and attacked the enemy flank. From the start, the enemy line was thrown into disarray. The men, trying to wheel the wings around and turn the ranks to face the shouting that came from every side. In the midst of this chaos, Laelius came on the scene. As the enemy backed away to prevent damage being inflicted from the rear, their front disintegrated. That gave even the men in the center the opportunity to climb to the top, though this they could never have succeeded in doing over such broken ground had the Carthaginian ranks remained solid, with the elephants positioned before the standards. There was slaughter on every side, and Scipio, who had charged the enemy right wing with his left, was wreaking particular havoc on the now exposed flanks. There was no room left at this point even for flight. Roman detachments had blocked the roads on both sides, to the right and to the left, and the camp gate had been shut by the commander and his officers as they made their escape. In addition, the elephants had been startled, and the Carthaginians were as afraid of the panic-stricken beast as they were of the enemy. The result was that some 8,000 men lost their lives. 19. Before joining battle, Hasdrubal had hurriedly amassed his war chest and sent ahead elephants, and now he headed along the river Tagus towards the Pyrenees, gathering up en route as many of the fugitives from the battle as he could. Scipio took possession of the enemy camp, conferring on his soldiers all the plunder apart from free persons, and in making an inventory of the prisoners, he found the number to be 10,000 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalrymen. Of these he sent home all the Spaniards without ransom, but he instructed his quaestor to sell off the Africans. After that, a crowd of Spaniards began to swarm around him, men who had surrendered earlier as well as those taken prisoner the day before, and they of one accord hailed him as their king. Scipio thereupon had silence proclaimed by the herald. The greatest name for him, he declared,
was the one with which his own soldiers had hailed him: general. The title of king, which had great prestige elsewhere, he explained, was anathema in Rome. As for his having the spirit of a king, it was, if that was what they considered the noblest thing in a man's character, that was for them to judge in silence, but they should avoid the use of the word. They became aware, then, barbarians though they were, of the greatness of the man's soul. This was a title at which all other human beings were agog with wonder, and he was looking down on it from a position of such superiority. After that, gifts were distributed amongst the Spanish chieftains and princes, and Scipio told Indibilis to choose any 300 horses that he liked from the large number that had been captured. When the quaestor, following his commander's orders, was putting the Africans on sale, he was told that there was amongst them a young male adult of strikingly good looks and of royal stock, and he sent him to Scipio. Scipio questioned the boy on his identity and nationality, and asked why he had been in military service at his age. He replied that he was Numidian, and his people called him Massiva, that he had been left an orphan by his father, and then been brought up in Galla, king of the Numidians, his grandfather on his mother's side. He had crossed to Spain with his uncle, Massinissa, who had recently come with his cavalry to assist the Carthaginians, but he had never before gone into battle, having been forbidden to do so by Massinissa on account of his age. On the day of the battle with the Romans, he had, behind his uncle's back, surreptitiously taken weapons and a horse, and gone into fight. But he had been thrown headlong when his horse fell, and had been captured by the Romans. Ordering a watch kept on the Numidian, Scipio completed all the official business he had to do. He then withdrew to his headquarters, summoned the boy, and asked him if he would like to go back to Massinissa. With tears of joy in his eyes, the boy replied that he really would like to do that. Scipio thereupon presented him with a gold ring, a tunic with the broad stripe, as well as a Spanish clock, a golden brooch, and a horse with its trappings, and then sent him on his way with some horsemen, who were ordered to escort the boy as far as he wished. 20. A council of war was held after that. Some of those present advised immediate pursuit of Hasdrubal, but Scipio felt this was dangerous. He feared that Mago and the other Hasdrubal might join forces with him. He therefore limited himself to sending a contingent to blockade the pass over the Pyrenees, and he himself spent the remainder of the summer accepting the submission of Spanish tribes. A few days after the battle of Bacula, at the time when Scipio, returning to Turaco, had left the pass of Castulo, the commanders Hasdrubal, son of Gizo, and Mago reached Hasdrubal from further Spain. This was assistance that came too late for Hasdrubal, the defeat having already been sustained, but their arrival was not at all inopportune for discussions on the conduct of the rest of the war. At their meeting, they exchanged intelligence on the sympathies of the Spaniards in each man's theatre of operations, and Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, expressed the opinion that the farthest reaches of Spain, the area on the ocean around Gades, had no experience of the Romans as yet, and so were still staunchly loyal to the Carthaginians. But only he thought this way. The other Hasdrubal and Mago were both agreed that the benefit Scipio had conferred had made a deep impression on all the Spaniards, tribes and individuals alike. They believed there would be no end to the desertions to the Romans
until all the Spanish troops were either removed to the most remote parts of Spain or led over into Gaul. So they said, even without the decree of the Carthaginian Senate, it would have been necessary for Hasdrubal to go to Italy. That was where the whole war was centered, but Hasdrubal would, at the same time, be taking all the Spanish forces out of Spain, far from the reputation Scipio had established. His army, they said, had been depleted by desertions and also by the defeat he had suffered, and they felt its numbers should be supplemented with Spanish troops. They further proposed that Mago transfer his army to Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, and cross in person to the Balearic Islands, with a large sum of money, to hire mercenary auxiliaries, and that Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, should withdraw deep into Lusitania with his army, and avoid engaging the Romans. Finally, they suggested that Massinissa should have a force of 3,000 horsemen made up from the cream of their entire cavalry, and that he make a sweep of hither Spain. Bringing assistance to allies and plundering enemy towns and farms. After taking these decisions, the commanders separated to put them into effect. Such were the year's developments in Spain. In Rome, Scipio's reputation was growing by the day. In the case of Fabius, although the capture of Tarentum was due to treachery rather than valor, it still redounded to his credit. Fulvius's reputation was on the wane, and Marcellus was even in disrepute. Apart from his poor performance in his battle, he had led his men off to their quarters in Venusia in midsummer, when Hannibal was still at large in Italy. Marcellus had a personal enemy in the plebeian tribune, Gaius Publicius Bibulus. Ever since that first battle, which had gone badly for Marcellus, Bibulus had been continually making speeches that had discredited him and made him unpopular with the plebs. Now he was advocating the annulment of his imperium. However, Marcellus's relatives gained authorization for him to leave a lieutenant in Venusia and come to Rome to clear himself of the charges that his enemies were bringing against him, and they also prevented any debate, in his absence, of the annulment of his command. As it happened, Marcellus reached Rome to fend off the humiliation he faced at the same time as the consul Quintus Fulvius arrived for the elections. 21. The debate over Marcellus's imperium took place in the Circus Flaminius, before a huge gathering of plebeians and people of all classes. The tribune of the plebs brought his charges not only against Marcellus, but against the nobility as a whole. It was thanks to the nobles' treacherous and dilatory conduct, he said, that Hannibal had been for 9 years now holding Italy as his own province, having spent more of his life there than in Carthage. The people of Rome were reaping the benefits of the extension of Marcellus's command, he added. His twice-beaten army was having its summer season quartered in Venusia. By citing his achievements, Marcellus so effectively rebutted this address of the tribune that not only was the bill to annul his imperium rejected, but the next day all the centuries elected him consul with tremendous unanimity. As his colleague, he was given Titus Quintius Crispinus, who was praetor at the time. The next day saw the following men elected to the praetorship: Publius Licinius Gracchus Dives,
the Pontificus Maximus, in brackets, Publius Licinius Varus, Sextus Julius Caesar, and Quintus Claudius. On the days on which the election took place, there was concern in the community about a revolt in Etruria. According to a letter from Gaius Calpurnius, the proprietor with responsibility for that area, the unrest had begun amongst the people of Arretium. The consul designate, Marcellus, was therefore swiftly dispatched to the region to investigate, and if the situation seemed to warrant it, he was to send for an army and transfer the theater of operations from Apulia to Etruria. Fear of this checked and restored order to the Etruscans. Ambassadors from Tarentum also sought a peace settlement that would grant them their independence and their own constitution, and the Senate's reply was that they should return when the consul Fabius arrived in Rome. Both the Roman and the plebeian games were that year repeated for a single day. Lucius Cornelius Claudinus and Lucius Cornelius Claudinus and Servius Sulpicius Galba were the curule aediles, and Gaius Servilius and Quintus Caecilius Metellus were the plebeian aediles. Servilius, people said, had not had the right to be tribune of the plebs, and had no right now to be aedile. For although it had been believed for 10 years that Servilius's father had been killed by the Boii near Mutina, while he was serving as one of the 3 land commissioners, it was now well established that he was still alive and in enemy hands. 22. In the 11th year of the Punic War, Marcus Marcellus and Titus Quintius Crispinus entered the consulship, this being Marcellus's 5th time in the office, counting the consulship, in which he did not actually serve because of irregularity in the electoral procedure. Both consuls were assigned Italy as their area of responsibility. They were granted the 2 armies of the previous year's consuls, and there was a 3rd that was, at that time, at Venusia, under the command of Marcellus. The consuls were to select the 2 they wanted out of the 3, and the 3rd would be put at the disposition of whichever commander would be allotted responsibility for Tarentum and the Salentini. The other responsibilities were distributed as follows. Of praetors, Publius Licinius Varus received the urban jurisdiction, and Publius Licinius Crassus the Pontifex Maximus, that over foreigners, and a further responsibility to be decided by the Senate. Sextus Julius Caesar received Sicily, and Quintus Claudius Tarentum. There was a year's extension of imperium for Quintus Fulvius Flaccus. His area of responsibility to be held with 1 legion was to be Capua, formerly under the praetor Titus Quinctius. Gaius Hostilius Tubulus also had his imperium extended, and he was to succeed Gaius Calpurnius as propraetor in Etruria at the head of 2 legions. There was also an extension of Lucius Veturius Philo's imperium, and he was to have Gaul as his province, as before, but now as propraetor, and with the same 2 legions with which he had held it as praetor. The Senate also decided that what was done for Lucius Veturius should also apply to Gaius Aurunculeius, who, as praetor, had had Sardinia as his province, and 2 legions under his command, and the proposal to extend his imperium was brought before the people. Urunculeus was further assigned, for the defense of his province, 50 warships that Publius Scipio would be sending from Spain. Publius Scipio and Marcus Silanus were both also assigned the provinces they currently held in Spain, along with their armies, for a year. Scipio was ordered to send over to Sardinia 50 of the 80 ships, now under his command, that he had brought with him from Italy or captured at New Carthage. For there were rumors of intensive naval preparations in Carthage that year, and it was said that the Carthaginians would blockade the entire coastline of Italy and of Sicily and Sardinia too, with 200 vessels. In Sicily, the division of resources was as follows. Sextus Caesar was given the army from Cannae. Marcus Valerius Laevinus, who also had his imperium extended, was to take over the fleet of 70 ships lying off Sicily, and to that number he was to add 30 vessels that had been off Tarentum the year before. With this 100-strong fleet, he would, if he concurred, cross to Africa on raiding expeditions. Publius Sulpicius also had his imperium extended for a year. With the fleet he already commanded, he was to take responsibility for Macedonia and Greece. There was no change made in arrangements for the 2 legions stationed at the city of Rome, and the consuls were authorized to raise supplementary forces wherever necessary. The defense of the Roman Empire that year rested on the 21 legions. The urban praetor, Publius Licinius Varus, was also assigned the task of refurbishing 30 old warships docked at Ostia, and furnishing 20 new ships with crews. He would thus have a fleet of 50 vessels to patrol the coastline in the vicinity of the city of Rome. Gaius Calpurnius was ordered not to move his army from Arretium before the arrival of his successor. Tibullus, like Calpurnius, was also instructed to be particularly on his guard against any subversive designs amongst people there. (22) In the 11th year of the Punic War, Marcus Marcellus and Titus Quinctius Crispinus entered the consulship, this being Marcellus's 5th time in the office, counting the consulship in which he did not actually serve because of irregularity in the electoral procedure. Both consuls were assigned Italy as their area of responsibility. They were granted the 2 armies of the previous year's consuls, and there was a third that was, at the time, at Venusia under the command of Marcellus. The consuls were to select the 2 they wanted out of the 3, and the third would be put at the disposition of whichever commander would be allotted responsibility for Tarentum and the Salentini. The other responsibilities were distributed as follows. Of the praetors, Publius Licinius Varus received the urban jurisdiction, and Publius Licinius Crassus the Pontifex Maximus, that over foreigners, and a further responsibility to be decided by the Senate. Sextus Julius Caesar received Sicily, and Quintus Claudius Tarentum. There was a year's extension of imperium for Quintus Fulvius Flaccus. His area of responsibility, to be held with 1 legion, was to be Capua, formerly under the praetor Titus Quinctius. I think I already anyway, we're reading this again. Yeah. Where are we here? I'm sorry, bear with me. Okay, moving right along. Continuing with
22 just the same. Gaius Hostilius Tubulus also had his imperium extended, and he was to succeed Gaius Calpurnius as propraetor in Etruria, at the head of 2 legions. There was also an extension of Lucius Veturius Philo's imperium, and he was to have Gaul as his province as before, but now as propraetor, and with the same 2 legions, with which he had held it as praetor. The Senate also decided that what was done for Lucius Veturius should also apply to Gaius Aurunculeius, who, as praetor, had Sardinia as his province with 2 legions under his command, and the proposal to extend his imperium was brought before the people. Aurunculeius was further assigned for the defense of his province 50 warships that Publius Scipio would be sending from Spain. Publius Scipio and Marcus Silanus were both also assigned the provinces they currently held in Spain, along with their armies for a year. Scipio was ordered to send over to Sardinia 50 of the 80 ships now under his command that he had brought with him from Italy or captured at New Carthage, for there were rumors of intensive naval preparations in Carthage that year, and it was said that the Carthaginians would blockade the entire coastline of Italy and of Sicily and Sardinia too, with 200 vessels. In Sicily, the division of resources went as follows. Sextus Caesar was given the army from Cannae. Marcus Valerius Laevinus, who also had his imperium extended, was to take over the fleet of 70 ships lying off Sicily, and to that number he was to add 30 vessels that had been off Tarentum the year before. With his 100-strong fleet he would, if he concurred, cross to Africa on raiding expeditions. Publius Sulpicius also had his imperium extended for a year. With the fleet he already commanded, he was to take responsibility for Macedonia and Greece. There was no change made in arrangements for the 2 legions stationed at the city of Rome, and the consuls were authorized to raise supplementary forces wherever necessary. The defense of the Roman Empire that year rested on 21 legions. Yes, now I'm positive I read this already. The urban praetor, Publius Licinius Varus, was also assigned the task of refurbishing 30 old warships docked at Ostia, and furnishing 20 new ships with crews. He would thus have a fleet of 50 vessels to patrol the coastline in the vicinity of the city of Rome. Gaius Calpurnius was ordered not to move his army from Arretium before the arrival of his successor. Tibulus, like Calpurnius, was also instructed to be particularly on his guard against any subversive designs amongst people there. 23. The praetors now left to take up their assignments, but religious concerns detained the consuls. After a number of prodigies had been reported, they were having difficulty obtaining favorable omens. From Campania had come reports of lightning striking 2 temples in Capua, those of Fortuna and Mars, as well as a number of tombs. At Cumae, it had been announced that mice had been gnawing at some gold in the temple of Jupiter. Such are the trivialities in which misguided superstition sees divine intervention. And at Casinum, that a huge swarm of bees had settled in the forum. At Ostia, it was said that the city wall and a gate had been struck by lightning. At Caere, that a vulture flew into the temple of Jupiter, and at Volsinae, that the lake was suffused with blood. A day of public prayer was held because of these prodigies, and over a number of days full-grown victims were sacrificed without favorable omens being attained. It was a long time before the favor of the gods was regained. In fact, the deadly events thus prophesied actually came down on the consuls' heads, and the state remained out of harm's way. The games of Apollo had first been celebrated by the urban praetor Publius Cornelius Sulla in the consulship of Quintus Fulvius and Appius Claudius. Since then, all the urban praetors had celebrated them, but they made the vow for 1 year only, and had no fixed date for the celebration. That year a serious epidemic broke out, which spread through the city and the countryside, but it led to chronic rather than fatal illness. Because of the epidemic, prayers were offered at crossroads throughout the city. In addition, the urban praetor, Publius Licinius Varus, was instructed to bring a bill before the people that a vow be made promising the games as a permanent fixture on a set date. Varus was the first to make the vow in these terms, and he celebrated the games on the 5th of July. That date was subsequently kept a holiday. 24. As the people of Arretium, the reports grew daily more serious, and the concerns of the senators were increasing. Gaius Hostilius was therefore sent written orders not to put off taking hostages from the people of Arretium, and Gaius Terentius Varro, whom Hostilius was to deliver them to be taken to Rome, was sent to the town with Imperium. When Varro arrived, Hostilius immediately ordered one of the legions that was encamped before the city to advance into it, and he deployed armed units at strategic points. Then, after summoning the senators, he made his demand for the hostages in the forum. When the Senate requested a 2-day period to consider the matter, Hostilius proclaimed that they must hand them over immediately, or else he would take all the children of the senators the following day. The military tribunes, allied officers, and centurions were then ordered to keep watch on the gates to prevent anyone leaving the city during the night. This was done in a rather slack and careless manner, however, and before nightfall, 7 leading members of the Senate slipped away with their children before sentinels were posted at the gates. Their absence was noticed at dawn the next day, when there was a roll call of senators in the forum, and their property was sold off. 120 hostages were taken from the remaining senators, these being the senators' own children, and they were handed over to Gaius Terentius to be escorted to Rome. In the Senate, Varro made the whole situation look more threatening than it had seemed earlier. Accordingly, since an uprising in Etruria appeared imminent, Gaius Terentius himself was instructed to take a single legion, one of the 2 urban legions, to Arretium, and with it secure the city. It was also decided that Gaius Hostilius should make a sweep of the whole province with the rest of the army, and take measures to ensure that subversive elements were given no opportunity for insurrection. When Gaius Terentius reached Arretium with his legion, he demanded from the magistrates the keys to the city gates, but the magistrates claimed the keys could not be found. Varro believed they had been dishonestly removed rather than lost through inattention, and he had different keys made for all the gates and carefully saw to it that he had everything under his control. He warned Hostilius with some urgency that his only hope of avoiding an Etruscan insurrection lay in taking steps ahead of time to make insurrection impossible. 25. After that, the issue of the Tarentines became the subject of heated debate in the Senate, in the presence of Fabius. Fabius was himself defending the people he had actually captured in war, but others were hostile, many claiming that their crime was as great as the Capuans, and their punishment should be too. A senatorial decree was passed on a motion by Manius Acilius that the town should be garrisoned, with all Tarentine citizens confined within the walls, and the whole question left in abeyance to be considered afresh when Italy was in a calmer state. There was as much dispute over Marcus Livius, the commander in the citadel of Tarentum.
some wanted to censure him in a senatorial decree, on the grounds that it was thanks to his negligence that Tarentum was betrayed to the enemy. Others proposed rewarding him for having defended the citadel over a 5-year period, and then being primarily responsible for Tarentum's recapture. Those between the extremes stated that it was to the censors, not the Senate, that responsibility for examining Livius' record belonged. And Fabius was of the opinion, he added, however, that he allowed that it was thanks to Livius and Tarentum that Tarentum was recovered, as Livius's friends had often declared in the Senate. For he said the town would not have had to be recovered if it had not been lost. One of the consuls, Titus Quintius Crispinus, set off for Lucania with supplementary troops to join the army that had been commanded by Quintus Fulvius Flaccus. As for Marcellus, religious problems arose in quick succession to prick his conscience and keep him in Rome. One such was the matter of his having promised a tempo to Honos and Virtus at Clastidium during the Gallic War, and its dedication now being regularly obstructed by the pontiffs. The pontiffs claim that it was not proper for a single shrine to be dedicated to more than one god. In the event of a lightning strike or some supernatural phenomenon within it, they said, expiation would be a problem, in that one could not be sure to which deity sacrifice should be made, for except in the case of certain gods, one victim could not properly be sacrificed to 2 deities. And so a shrine to Virtus was added, the work being hurriedly carried out. But the temples were not, in fact, dedicated by Marcellus himself. Marcellus then finally set off with reinforcements for the army he had left at Venusia the year before. Because he believed that the recovery of Tarentum had earned Fabius a great reputation, Crispinus attempted to blockade Leucre in Bruttium. He had sent for all kinds of artillery and siege engines from Sicily, and he had had ships brought from there, too, to make an assault on the seaward part of the city. But the blockade was raised because Hannibal had moved his forces to Lacinium, and also because of a rumor that Crispinus' colleague, Marcellus, with whom he wished to join up, had already led his army from Venusia. Crispinus, therefore, moved back into Apulia from Bruttium, and at a point between Venusia and Bantia, the consuls established their 2 camps less than 3 miles distant from each other. As the war had now been diverted from Locri, Hannibal also returned to this same region. Both consuls were impetuous by nature, and they deployed their battle lines almost on a daily basis, fully confident that the war could be brought to an end if the enemy engaged the 2 consular armies that were now united. 26. Hannibal had been both a winner and a loser in his 2 engagements with Marcellus the previous year. While therefore neither hope nor fear was unreasonable on his part, if he had to fight the same man, he did think that he would be no match at all for the 2 consuls together. He therefore focused entirely on his old strategy, and began to search for a location for an ambush. There were, however, a number of skirmishes between the 2 camps, producing mixed results. The consuls believed the summer could be drawn out with such encounters, and, thinking that an offensive against Locri could also be mounted, they sent written instructions to Lucius Cincius to cross from Sicily to Locri with his fleet. To make an assault on the walls possible from the land as well, they gave orders for part of the army that was garrisoning Tarentum to be brought to Locri. Hannibal learned of this scenario from some people of Thurii, and he sent men to lie in ambush on the road from Tarentum. There, at the foot of the hill of Petelia, 3,000 cavalry and 2,000 infantry were placed in hiding. The Romans walked into them without conducting reconnaissance, and fell into the trap. Close to 2,000 men were killed, and about 1,500 taken alive. The rest scattered in flight and returned to Tarentum through the fields and woods. The tree-covered hill lay between the Carthaginian and Roman camps. At first, neither side took possession of it. The Romans were unaware of the features of the side of the hill facing the enemy camp, and Hannibal had considered it better suited for an ambush than an encampment. Hannibal had therefore sent a number of Numidian squadrons there during the night for the purpose, and hidden them in the middle of the wood. In the daytime none of the men would move from the position for fear that their arms or they themselves might be spotted from afar. In the Roman camp the troops were noisily demanding that the hill be seized and secured with a fort, otherwise, they said, if it were seized by Hannibal, they might have the enemy virtually at their throat. This made Marcellus sit up. "Why do we not ourselves go and reconnoitre with a few horsemen?" he said to his colleague. "Seeing for ourselves will give us a better idea of what to do." Crispinus agreed, and they set off with 220 cavalrymen, 40 from Fregellae, and the rest from Etruria. Along with them went the military tribunes, Marcus Marcellus, son of the consul, and Aulus Manlius, as well as the two allied officers, Lucius Aurelius and Manius Ullius. Some had recorded that the consul Marcellus conducted a sacrifice that day, and that after the first victim had been slaughtered, the liver was found to be lacking its head. In the second animal, everything normally there was found in place, that there was in fact an enlargement in the head. But the priest was not at all pleased to find entrails simply too propitious appearing after those which were undersized and deformed. In fact, the consul Marcellus was so eager to engage the enemy that he could say that their respective camps were never close enough to each other. And on that occasion, as he emerged from his defense works, he gave the signal for each man to be ready at his post. They were to gather up the baggage and follow, should the hill that they were going to reconnoitre prove to their liking. Before the camp lay a small stretch of flat ground, and from it a road ran up the hill, completely open to view from every direction. When the Numidians had been put in position, there was no expectation of a great opportunity like this coming their way. There was just the hope that they would intercept men who strayed too far from their camp, looking for food or wood. But now their scout gave them the signal to emerge, all at the same time, from their hiding places. Those who had to raise up from the brow of the hill, right in front of the Romans, did not let themselves be seen until men had made their way round to cut off the path to their rear. Then they all sprang out on every side and attacked with a shout. The consuls were in a hollow, unable to climb the slope, occupied by the enemy, and yet having no way to beat a retreat because they were surrounded at the rear. The engagement could nonetheless have gone on longer, had the Etruscans not started to flee, striking panic in the others. Even so, deserted though they were by the Etruscans, the Phrygallian cavalry did not give up the fight, as long as the consuls were unwounded and kept things going, shouting encouragement and themselves participating in the action. But then they saw both consuls receive wounds, with Marcellus run through by a lance and slipping from his horse, on the point of death. At that, they too, the very few still surviving, took to flight along with the consul Crispinus, who had been struck by 2 javelins, and the young Marcellus, who was also wounded. The military tribune, Aulus Manlius, fell in battle, and of the 2 allied officers, Manius Aulus was killed, and Lucius Irenaeus taken prisoner. 5 of the consul's lictors fell into enemy hands, alive, and the others either perished or made good their escape with the consul. 43 cavalrymen went down either in the engagement or as they fled, and 18 were taken alive. There had been uproar in the camp, the men clamoring to go to the consul's aid, but then they saw the consul and the other consul's son, both of them wounded, and the meager remains of the ill-starred expedition returned to camp. The death of Marcellus was a matter for great regret in any case, but it was the more so because he had blindly thrown himself, his colleague, and one might almost say the entire republic into a reckless situation. And that was not in keeping with his age. He was then more than 60, or the caution one would have expected from a seasoned commander. It would involve me in many detours around a single episode where I to try to follow up in detail all the variant accounts of Marcellus's death. Let me pass over others and focus on Coelius, who gives 3 different sequences of action. One is the traditional version, the second comes from the next of the eulogy given by the son who participated in the action, and the third is one that Coelius presents as having been researched and established by himself. But while there is variation in the story, most report that Marcellus left camp to reconnoitre, and all that he was caught in an ambush. 28. Hannibal felt the death of one of the consuls and the wounding of the other had truly terrified his enemy. Not to let slip any opportunity, he immediately moved his camp to the hill on which the engagement had taken place. There he found the buried Marcellus' body. Crispinus daunted both of his colleagues' death. Crispinus, daunted both by his colleague's death and his own wound, left the following night, when all was quiet, and encamped on the first mountains he reached, in an elevated spot, offering protection on all sides. The 2 commanders then revealed their ingenuity, one trying to set a trap, the other to avoid one. Hannibal had taken possession of Marcellus's ring when he found the corpse, and Crispinus, fearing the seal might be craftily used by the Carthaginian for some forgery, had sent messengers around the nearby communities to inform them that his colleague had been killed and that the enemy had his ring. He warned them not to put their trust in any letter written in Marcellus's name. This message from the consul had reached Salapia slightly before a letter written in Marcellus's name was brought from Hannibal. This stated that Marcellus would be coming to Salapia the night of that very day, and the soldiers in the garrison should be at the ready in case he needed their services for anything. The people of Salapia saw through the trick. They thought Hannibal was looking for a way to punish them, angry not simply over their abandoning his cause, but also in the killing of his cavalrymen. They sent back the messenger, who was in fact a Roman deserter, so that their soldiers could do what they wanted done without being observed. They then placed townspeople on watch along the walls and at the strategic points in town, but put sentries and patrols on high alert for the night and posted the strongest troops they had in the garrison at the gate by which they thought the enemy would come. Hannibal approached the city at about the fourth watch, and at the front of his column were Roman deserters bearing Roman arms. When they reached the gate, these men, all speaking Latin, called out the watchmen and told them to open up, since the consul was coming. Just as if they had been woken by the shouts, the watchmen bustled and scurried about and strained to open the gate. The portcullis had been lowered, and some now used crowbars, others ropes to raise it, bringing it up to a sufficient height for men to be able pass under it standing up. No sooner was there enough room for them to pass than the deserters came racing through the gateway. When about 600 had entered, the rope holding it was released, and the portcullis came down with a loud crash. A number of the Salapians then attacked the deserters, who, anticipating a peaceable reception, had their arms nonchalantly slung from their shoulders after their march. Others stood on the gate towers and the walls and chased off the enemy with stones, stakes, and javelins. So it was that Hannibal left the area, hoist with his own petard. He set off to raise the siege of Leucre, which had now been started by Lucius Cincius, who was conducting an all-out attack with siege works and all sorts of artillery that he had brought from Sicily. By this time, Mago felt little confidence in his ability to hold and defend the city of Locri, and his first glimmer of hope arrived with the news of Marcellus's death. Right after that came the message that Hannibal had sent ahead his Numidian cavalry, and was himself making all possible haste to follow up with his infantry column. And so, as soon as Mago learned, from a signal from the watchtower, that the Numidians were approaching, he himself suddenly flung open the gate and made a defiant sortie against the enemy. The battle at first hung in the balance, more because Mago had taken the Romans by surprise than because he could match them in strength. Then the Numidians arrived on the scene, and the Romans were struck with such panic that they bolted in disorder to the sea, and their ships, abandoning the siege works and equipment they had been using to pound the walls. So it was that the siege of Locri was raised by Hannibal's arrival. 29. When Crispinus discovered that Hannibal had left for Bruttium, he ordered the military tribune Marcus Marcellus to lead off to Venusia the army that had been under his colleague's command. He himself left for Capua with his own legions, barely able to stand the jolting of his litter, such being the severity of his wounds. He also wrote a letter to Rome about his colleague's death, and the great danger in which he now found himself. He could not, he said, come to Rome for the elections. He felt he would be unable to stand the rigors of the journey, and he was concerned about Tarentum. Hannibal might take his army there from Bruttium. He should, he added, be sent some representatives of the Senate, discerning individuals with whom he could discuss his wishes vis-a-vis state policy. When this letter was read out, it brought deep sorrow over the death of one of the consuls, and grave concern about the other. The Senate therefore sent Quintus Fabius the Younger to the army in Venusia, and 3 senatorial representatives, Sextus Julius Caesar, Lucius Licinius Pollio, and Lucius Cincius Alimentus, who had returned from Sicily a few days earlier, were sent to the consul. The representatives had instructions to inform the consul that if he were unable to come in person to Rome for the elections, he should appoint a dictator within Roman territory to supervise them. They were also to say that if the consul left for Tarentum, it was the will of the Senate that the praetor, Quintus Claudius, should lead his legions from the town to where he could offer protection to the greatest number of cities belonging to Roman allies. During that same summer, Marcus Valerius crossed from Sicily to Africa with a fleet of 100 ships. Landing at the city of Clupea, he inflicted widespread devastation on the countryside and met virtually no armed resistance. The marauding troops were then swiftly brought back to the ships because word suddenly came that a Punic fleet was approaching. The fleet numbered 83 ships, and the Roman admiral fought a successful engagement against them not far from Clupea. 18 ships were captured, and the rest put to flight. Valerius then returned to Lilybaeum with ample spoils from his land operations and the sea battle. That same summer, Philip answered an appeal for assistance from the Achaeans. Machanidas, tyrant of the Spartans, had been causing them great distress with a war on their border, and the Aetolians, too, had been conducting raids on them with forces that they ferried on ships across the strait between Naupactus and Patrae, locally called Rion. There was also a report that the king of Asia, Attalus, was about to cross to Europe because at their most recent consul meeting, the Aetolians had conferred on him their people's highest office.